So could you please state your name, your date of birth, and your region of birth?
My name is Ziad Gadou. I was born on the 9th of July, 1994, and I'm from Port Said, Egypt.
Okay. And could you tell me where your family migrated to and sort of lay it out for me, where they migrated to and when they migrated?
So we moved to Saudi Arabia, moved to Jeddah in late 99, early 2000. We moved from Port Said then, and yeah.
And did you live anywhere other than Jeddah?
Yes, we moved to Muscat in Oman in the year 2006. And then I moved separately to Sharjah, the UAE, in 2012.
And why did your family choose Saudi Arabia, do you think?
So my dad is a doctor, and at the time, I think for the last, few decades, Egyptians do take teaching jobs and doctor jobs and engineer jobs in different parts of the GCC. And Egyptians are much more connected in Saudi. So he had a friend who worked in Jeddah, and he told him about this opportunity, and he took it.
And what was the case for when they moved to Oman?
Exact same idea. My dad works so patients. So when patients talk to each other. So one of the patients who happened to go to Oman spoke to a doctor in Oman and told him there was this great doctor who worked in Jeddah 6 years after we moved to Jeddah, and he contacted my father and he told him we have an opportunity, and it was a much better opportunity for my dad, so he took it and left.
All right. And when you think of moving to Jeddah and moving to Muscat, what comes to mind? What are some of your earliest memories of these places?
I had a very I had a lot of fun in Jeddah. I didn't experience any kind of restriction. I was a child. I enjoyed it. We went to a school that was exclusively non-Saudi. So we were all expats. We all kind of, as outsiders, we belonged together. So I don't remember. And we were in a segregated school, so boys and girls were separated. But we did have friends like outside schools. The families were friends, and etc. So it was a community. I enjoyed my time in Saudi. I developed a lot of good friendships. I liked the schoolwork. I enjoyed my hobbies. It was a very healthy environment in general. So I have very fond associations, very fond, warm associations with Jeddah. Oman was a different conversation because I had moved to a completely local environment. I was a minority in the school that I went to in Oman, and you had to be aware of the Omani culture. You had to to speak a little bit to belong. You had to kind of conform more because you were an outsider, and outsiders were not taken in. They were initiated, and quote unquote, they had to kind of grow into the community. So I think my warmer association is with Saudi, and then Oman I kind of grew into very roughly, which took some time.
Yeah. When it comes to Jeddah, other than your dad's friend, did you guys know a lot of people who live there already, or did you have any family that lived there already?
So no, no, we had no immediate family, no, or even extended, like no.
Okay. And I know you said you were in a very multinational setting. Did you find that you sought out Egyptians, or was it just, you were friends with whoever?
Not at all. I only became friends with Egyptians much later in life. I spoke Levant. I spoke Lebanese, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Syrian. Each one of these communities I spoke Levant with, their specific Levant. No, I actually did not at all. We had some family friends, but we all kind of have similar experiences. We all went to other mixed schools, mixed nationality schools. So we all spoke Lebanese with each other, and I studied the Lebanese curriculum in primary school for the Arabic, Lebanese, and stuff. Yeah, so it wasn't Egyptian came much later in life.
طب لو كده A, did you go back to Egypt often? And B, did you find it difficult to sort of switch back into Egyptian when you did?
For sure. So we were very Egyptian at home. So we ate the food and we فرجنا على المسلسلات and we watched the shows and everything. But outside home, we were whatever the environment let us be, I think. I learned early on that you kind of we were liquid almost. We took the shape of the places we were in. We didn't necessarily we don't really like we don't really walk in alpha. No, we kind of like just wait to see what the community is like, and then you kind of learn to play that game. We went back home every summer to see the grandparents and the extended family, and for my parents to see their parents, etc. And we stayed connected with our family and relatives and all. We still are very close. But in general, being Egyptian didn't come until much later in life. For me, at least, my parents were very Egyptian, but I didn't understand it until much later.
Do you have any siblings?
2.
Do you feel like it was the same for them?
The middle brother, my younger brother, I'm the one I'm closer to in age, pretty much experienced it the way I did until recently. So until 3-4 years ago, that was when I experienced something very different that he didn't experience. My attachment to Egypt became bolder then. My youngest brother moved around a lot, and he learned what it was like to be an Egyptian because of us, because of the household. And then when my mother and my youngest brother moved back to Egypt in a more permanent way, a few years ago, he developed that kind of belonging or identity. But no, we've experienced things differently, I think.
How would you say that your experience has been different than theirs?
So we grew up, I being the eldest, and being the first kind of, the first child they trust with the world or trust the world with. My parents gave instructions. There are things you don't talk about. Don't worry if someone makes fun of this or that. If you are bullied a certain way, let go. You know what I mean? It's their country, it's not yours, etc. So at least that kind of tone. And I played along for the most part. My brothers watched me and did the exact opposite of that. So my brothers were a lot more vocal early on. For example, every international school or every one of these mixed schools had like a global day or an international day. So that was the day of the year where you were like celebrating the fact that you are from somewhere else. That was one of the few days a year where in school, in the environment of school, you were allowed to bring out who you are and celebrate it, dress up, get the food, everything. مثلا when the Egyptian national team would play games, friendly games or international games against the local teams, and they would, usually win. And that's the day I go to school, like I hold my head high and I'm, so that was the kind of thing. And being Egyptian is unlike being any other nationality in the Middle East. Being Egypt is a center, is a mental cultural center for a lot of just Arabic countries in general, Middle Eastern countries. We were always given that kind of importance implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but mostly it was like that. The word Egyptian has some weight in it. That it took me personally some time to not push that away because of some of the negative experiences I experienced. My brothers, again, were much more vocal about it. So they were vocal. They just allowed themselves to feel Egyptian early on. I was like, nah, got me in trouble early on. So yeah.
I'm curious, and obviously only if you don't mind sharing, if there are any things that come to mind in particular when you think about negative experiences.
Plenty. Plenty. Kids can be cruel, I think, in any setting, whether in Egypt or elsewhere. But being Egyptian comes with a certain stereotype. There is a regional stereotype that Egyptians occupy certain jobs and they speak with a broken English accent. And of course, I was surrounded in a very privileged environment of international school. Everybody spoke perfect English. And yeah, I mean, I remember the worst it ever came to was a teacher. There was a teacher who's mid-class just started mimicking an Egyptian. And there was me and another Egyptian girl in class, and he went far, and I stood up and I left the class. And I'm not sure if that's why he left the school. I don't know. Like, we kind of escalated it. My parents were always ready for that. My parents are very, very identity driven. I called my mother. She came to school. We raised it. We escalated the conversation. She's like, I'm gonna go to the ministry and this and this. This is clear racism. You need to understand whatever, whatever. And we managed to put an end to it, basically. But on a smaller scale in class, things were also, things happened in class. Things happened. But I think the teacher incident was the worst I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I have just the amount of casual racism that would occur in my school. Just the fact that like people would call people Yal Masri like as an insult, like wish I like
All the
very
time,
commonly.
all the time, all the time, all the time, all the time. I don't remember a week in Oman, in my time in Oman, because also my time in Saudi, because I was surrounded by other expats. We were casually playful, but we understood that we were all outsiders, so we belonged. But in Oman, again, because it was a minority-majority situation, no, things got very hurtful. And to this day, I don't really look back at it in fondly. Like, I did not like school at all. Like, when I graduated, I remember that was the happiest I ever was in, because I was out of that environment where I felt mine still like small per se, and it took years for me not to for me to embrace who I am. It took years. So yeah, that's true, very true.
I'm curious what led you to decide to stay in the GCC for university and particularly why the UAE?
So my parents are very I want to say, just like any parents, I think they're protective. So as also the eldest, so they try things with us. So as the eldest, they wanted to keep me close but also distant. So you do your thing, you try your adventure, you try being a university student, but also I'm an hour away from Muscat, so I can just fly whenever. And the UAE was a perfect, safe, well funded, well structured, well mixed, very diverse. And we had come for trips like on Eid. We would sometimes drive to Dubai. So my parents were aware of the place, and they're like, yeah, this is a good, gray, safe option. And yeah, pretty much that.
Was there anything that surprised you about moving to the UAE, or were there any challenges that you had settling in?
So when I moved to the UAE, I was 18 and I was fresh out of a very closed environment. Oman is not like the UAE at all. Oman's like if there's a scale to how kind of integrated the youth is, for example, I would say Saudi, which is changing now, but Saudi at the time, Oman is in the middle, and the UAE is all the way on the right. But also, I was in Sharjah, so Sharjah was more conservative than Dubai or Abu Dhabi per se. So Sharjah was also a more conservative UAE. You know what I mean? So the first kind of shocker to me was how many Egyptians were on campus, because I had not been around Egyptians. I did not integrate with young Egyptians. My Egyptians were my cousins, my uncles, and my aunts, and my grandparents. I did not have Egyptians friends of the same age. I did not understand their lingo. I did not listen to their music. I did not grow up on the streets playing football. I did not watch Al Ahly wa Zamalek. I did not loved the shows that my mother watched. I loved the masrahiyat that my dad watched. I did not develop a demographical kind of in the same kind of age group with مثلا whatever the age that we come from. I did not belong to that. So that was the first thing. And that took like a wall. I had that wall started melting very slowly, but it did. So for me to meet like-minded Egyptians was very empowering, extremely empowering. It's like, yeah, we exist. Those people that just don't know where they belong on the scale. So that was a big one for me. And I also I stopped speaking in other accents. So I started speaking Egyptian primarily. And I became unapologetic about it, because I used to feel like nobody's going to understand me when I speak, or they're going to make fun of me. These were the only two outcomes. Either someone's going to say, I don't get you, or whatever. They're going to make fun of my accent. That was a big it paved the way for that kind of confidence. Yeah, I think these were the immediate reactions. Yeah.
And when you say like-minded, are you referring to other Egyptians who grew up in the GCC as well?
Yes. And some who came from Egypt. So it was also realizing that there are different types of Egyptians. It's not like they all كده وكده. لا, there are Egyptians who were privileged, there are Egyptians who were not as privileged, there are Egyptians who like language and like music and like art, and there are Egyptians who don't like that. And that was I had a full spectrum almost, طبعا in a small scale in the university, but I did have a spectrum. And I started out in engineering, and Egyptian parents, and their boys either go to engineering or medical school. So I also got to see a stereotypical Egyptian family point their kid this way, and I also saw the rebellious phase of these kids. So I got to experience the whole spectrum of it.
Before university, what was your relationship with other Egyptians where you lived?
So in Saudi, it was the family friends. It was the kids of the family friends. And sometimes, occasionally, we would go to, the summer trip where your family goes to like a masyaf or somewhere to just go to the beach. There would be occasionally this Egyptian family and their kid, and we would just end up getting along, and we would be like just friends of masyaf, like these, and they were very sacred to us growing up. You know what I mean? So one of them or two of them I became close to as a child, and then later on in life, their family also moved to Oman, so we ended up being friends. I don't recall a lot of Egyptian friends in primary school, to be honest with you. I do not recall it. And in Oman, which was junior high and high school, we had a couple of Egyptian guys, but not as much at all. So I felt I always felt since I was a child until I graduated from school that I had this mission or this weight of representing my country in the best light possible. The very few Egyptians I had around, I was very critical of. Like I always no, stop, don't be this way, don't be that way. You were not looking, whatever. I felt this kind of responsibility or whatever. But the point, I think the answer to your question is I didn't have many, and the few I had, I didn't necessarily get along with.
That's so interesting because I feel like my parents had a very similar, energy of, prove them wrong, which is just.
I still don't understand what is this duty. That's a question that I genuinely have not, I did not really open this question up to anyone or to myself, but that's an interesting conversation to have. Yeah.
But when you were making the effort, when you were exercising the duty, how did that manifest itself?
Hmm. So I remember, so on a bit of a side note, so one of the few examples that I had was later on in life in university, I developed an interest in spoken word poetry. I started writing and performing poetry on stage. And one of the pieces that I ended up performing and it became a crowd favorite was a piece in which I start by talking in a broken English accent. And this piece gets laughter and then instant regret. Because at some point in the piece, it flips. I go fluent and I start essentially putting them on the spot, like, oh, that's why you laughed. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So the audience is usually left um, ashamed and they start like, oh, so that was wrong. That's some built-in racism that we haven't dealt with. And that piece brings a lot of justice to the Egyptians in the crowd. Every time I perform it, Egyptians will come to me, thank you so much. We needed this, you know? And that's a piece that is like, I think it's exemplary of a lot of what I tried to do as a child, which is um, at first run away from it. I am not that. And then actually, I am that and more, and there's reason for it, and you're a part of it. So there's a lot of introspective kind of. At first, it was kind of I don't know, self hate or self deprecating, and then it turned into critical thinking that turned into that's what it really is. There's a lot of historical layers to this. My grandparents lived in Saudi for a while, and they would have stories. My grandmother would tell me stories about how being an Egyptian was not necessarily equivalent to something good. It was kind of synonymous with working class term or some sort of a demeaning kind of term. So this is not new. And this clearly has some precedent, some historical precedent. But yeah, it was like what I tried to do for the most is try to understand this cultural hegemony that we had or have didn't translate into micro interactions. You know what I mean? Yes, all our shows and all our masrahiyat and all our comedy is known to them, but that doesn't change the way they look at me. You know what I mean? It didn't. So that's the kind of gap that I tried to fill with my friends, with my family, etc.
No, I've definitely always thought about that. Like, there's such a clear distinction of almost like a respect or a reverence, but it's completely detached from like your present self or who you are. It's like a culture that exists from like outside of you. You have no connection to it at all. And
Yeah,
it's,
and only exists in football.
yeah, no, genuinely. I'm really curious to know more about your grandparents. So, when did they move to Saudi? And had anyone else from that generation moved?
So not from my family besides my grandparents. So my maternal grandparents moved to, I think, Medina, I believe. And this was before the war. So between 67 and 73. At the time, احنا من بورسعيد. So Bursaid was hit very heavily in 56 and then hit again in 67 or يعني essentially they had to leave. Both my parents were kind of, you know, let's say call them internal refugees. They moved from Bursaid to I think Al Mansoura and Dumyat respectively, but way before they met and they got married. So when my maternal grandparents moved, my aunt was born. So my mom is also the eldest, the aunt. So my mother stayed back in Egypt, and my grandparents lived in Saudi for about 6 years. My grandmother is a teacher, is an Arabic teacher, so she taught at a school. And my grandfather was a lawyer, but I'm not sure exactly what kind of job he worked in. I think it was some government office. But I don't know much about it from my grandfather. I didn't manage to ask him all these questions. He had passed away before. But my grandmother speaks fondly of the family members of the friends that she had made in Medina. طبعا living in Medina is a very surreal experience for a lot of Muslims, يعني. Because you end up living in the city of the Prophet, where the Prophet migrated. So it was a very surreal experience for her, and my aunt was born there. And I don't know. I think that's the extent of what I remember her telling me. I wish I asked her more, to be honest. But she speaks fondly of it. And again, my mother's side of the family بيروحوا يحجوا كل سنة or 2 other years. Every other year they manage to organize الحج مع بعض. So there's always I think I have an extended uncle who goes every year. I think it's been 27 years that he has not missed Hajj once. Like, yeah, so that's kind of the relationship my family has with Saudi until we moved there. Yeah.
That's incredible. Do they still live, most of them, in Saudi?
So they go to Hajj. To my knowledge, that my mom's uncle goes still every year, and he moved to the States. He got married, she converted, and they still go to Hajj every year. So it's really crazy to me. But no, I mean, since we left Saudi, none of my family members have went back.
I guess this has the same energy of, when like you go you visit your family and uncle's like بتحبي أكتر السعودية ولا ما أعرفش إيه. But I'm curious. They would ask that all the time.
All the time.
And it's
all
like, what do you want from me? I'm 5. Like,
oh, that's very true. That's very true.
But my version of that question is, how would you compare your relationship with Bursaid to your relationship with Cairo?
Wow. So Bursaid is always going to be home. In memory, like it's always going to be. I lived in it. I lived in it for 5 years as a child. I remember the 90s, yeah, very fondly. What makes me a 90s kid is those 5 years. It's those cassette tapes and these leather jackets and these old cars and all these Amr Diab cliches. So that I fondly remember. And it's also the association I have with my grandmother's house, Furside. We didn't live in my parents' place very long. We ended up leaving to Saudi. So whenever we went back to Egypt, we went to Bursaid and we stayed at my grandmother's house. Everyone, my parents, my brothers, my cousins, we all stayed at my grandmother's house. So my grandmother's house in Bursaid will always be home, if that exists. So that's the closest to an idea of home. But Cairo بقى at a later stage, especially when I went back 3 years ago, that's when Cairo came into the picture. That's when I started developing a relationship with Cairo. And I had not seen Egypt. I had not seen Egypt since. Until then, I experienced Egypt as an expat going to see his family. You don't get to do much. You get to spend time with your family, with your cousins. Sometimes you go out with your friends, whatever few friends you have, and that's that. But going back as an adult, that was different. That was Cairo and Alexandria for the first time. I first time ever been to Alexandria was 3 years ago. So, yeah, no, for sure, Bursaid is more home. Cairo is more like, I think, a re-establishment or rediscovery of my relationship with Egypt.
That's really interesting. And only if you're like willing or want to share, could you talk more to that rediscovery or that like homecoming?
Right, homecoming. I like that. So I went back to enlist for the mandatory service. And during my time in those 3 years, so when I first went back, there's like about 6 months or 5 months of paperwork and tests and all that. So in those 4 or 5 months, I spent most of it in an apartment that my late grandfather left to the family to use for just running errands in general. Anybody who had some things to do in Cairo, they would come, get the errands done, and go back. So I had this apartment to myself. And what I would do is I would spend most of my time walking or going to different parts of Cairo. I would take a taxi somewhere different, and I would just walk. Um, and I discovered there's this whole place that I just had no idea. I knew of it. I've seen it in movies. I just didn't internalize it. I just did not have any relationship with. I did not establish a connection with. And so I started having favorite spots. I started having a favorite coffee shop, a favorite juice place, a favorite supermarket, a favorite. And I would, and you know, in Egypt, you just meet people, just talk to them. There's no reason for you not to talk to the stranger, especially as a man. I can't say the same for women, but as a guy, I can safely say that it's easier to develop a conversation with someone walking down. Taxi drivers are a whole conversation. But that kind of thing. So I started going to Zamalek and Masr al-Adima and different parts of, can't remember for the life of me. But during that time, I was just, and I started making friends naturally because I was moving back. So I started to make old connections come back. So old friends from Bursaid that I knew for some reason, old neighbors, other expat friends who moved back. So I would get in touch with them. So I went to like Tajammu بقى والحتت دي, all these places, and I went to Alexandria for the first time, which was a whole like discovery. Alexandria is the most beautiful city on earth, like this ridiculously beautiful city. And I realized I needed this connection. It was a part of me that I missed, that I didn't even know I missed. So, and then when I went into the service, I had, in the army in general, the most prominent thing is meeting Egyptians from all parts of Egypt, from all social classes. People that naturally there are barriers that stop you from seeing them. There are people in parts of Egypt that you will never see. Unless you voluntarily go, they will not cross your paths. So there is this kind of natural segregation or unnatural segregation that keeps certain people from certain cities and keeps you from it. So in the service, I got to see dudes from like the southern part of the country that take 16-hour trains to get to Cairo, or someone who lives in like الوادي الجديد, شمال سيناء, أسوان وأسيوط وقنا والمنيا, these places that I've only heard of in stories or popular songs, like أو مسرحيات, like and people who spoke different accents, who ate different foods, who dressed up. كل واحد كان ليه الجلابية بشكل مختلف. They dressed up different costumes, different outfits. They had their own traditions. They had people get married there, and they had different kind of taqalid wa adat and stuff. And it was like completely like an eye-opening experience. I'm like, there's a whole country that I didn't know of. A whole country, you know. And that was kind of like my redemption, or my like homecoming, like you said, you know what I mean? That was my homecoming. I really managed to experience Egypt in a very completely different way than this isolated, privileged expat experience, which is stay with your aunt, stay with your uncle, stay with your grandmother. So yeah, I think that's my answer, I guess.
No, like I can imagine the contrast is insane. And I'm just curious as to how, or if you being, an expat kid played out in the beginning or in your interactions with people.
So you're talking about my recent experience. For sure. It gave you a certain lesson, because Egypt is a kind of class-based society. So when I say that I studied in American university, that's a +1. And then, you speak English, +3. So there are certain privilege. There's certain privilege that gets you far in an Egyptian society. So by default, I was ahead in that community. And it also allowed me to maneuver as an outsider. So you get a safe space to observe, but you do feel excluded. You know what I mean? You do feel a little excluded, not a little, a lot excluded. But with time, and that's what I was allowed to do, given, so the service is 14 months. And 14 months is a good time to develop bonds with people, for them to trust you. Because usually I come and leave. Usually I'm there for a few months. Oh, he's leaving anyways. Not this time. So this time I was in the same boat as these guys. We were going through the same things every day. My privilege did not protect me. My privilege got me to certain things where I shared those same spaces with them. But for 14 months, we were all going through the same thing. So I was protected and sheltered of my privilege as well. If I got punished, we all got punished, all of us. If we were rewarded, everybody was rewarded. We didn't eat, everybody didn't eat. We ate, everybody ate. So that allowed me and allowed others, I think it allowed me to first of all lift this veil of privilege off myself first, to accept that there's like, stop thinking of yourself this highly and go down to earth. You know what I mean? Just go back down to earth, see things for what they are. And thus, as a reaction, people saw me for who I am, or it allowed me to become this person outside of all these realities. That was like a very, in a way, it was a freeing experience for me. In that light, in that regard, it was a freeing, chainless experience where I got to be whoever I wanted to be then. Truly, you know what I mean? I got to be whatever you want to call it, Ibn Shara, Ibn Hara, whatever, Saidi, you want to call it, whatever it is, مسميات. I got to be this with all of that. يعني I got to be Saidi مع الصعيدي وابن شارع مع ابن الشارع. خلاص عرفت ألعب. I knew how to play this game and I understood the rules of it. Yeah, it was a unbelievable experience for sure.
I have two questions.
Please.
My first one is when you introduce yourself to people, either in Egypt or in the UAE, do you find that your migration history comes up?
Yeah, for sure. Especially with, I don't know, it depends really on where the environment is. So in the UAE, because we're mostly expats, so everybody has their expat story. Almost everyone has this shared kind of journey. So it's with time it kind of stops being, amazing, and it just becomes a shared experience. In Egypt, that's a different story. In Egypt, that's a thing. So in Egypt, you are kind of like, you're special, for sure. But the frequency of people coming back has, I think, increased a lot. So because I can, or maybe that's my experience, or that's what I've experienced, because I have friends in Egypt who I've rekindled friendships in Egypt that were also guys who moved back. So there's more of expats going back to Egypt, way more than I thought. So it comes up, and funny enough, these people shelter into themselves. It's a bit of an irony that they struggle to integrate. They actually do. I believe so. Yeah. So it comes up, a kid, and it doesn't leave you ever, no matter how long you stay.
That segues very nicely into my last question, which is how do you think that migration has impacted your family, but also you?
Okay, so there's allow me to draw this metaphor or this analogy. So there's this Marvel show called The What Ifs. And The What Ifs basically is these alternate realities where, I don't know how big of a superhero fan you are. So let's just say instead of Batman living, he gets killed. This is not Marvel, but let's just say. And this show is purely about that. These alternate realities where these superheroes experience life very differently. They survive this incident, they get married, they live happily ever after. Oh, cool. Let's write that. So I always picture my life as a what if episode. In what if I didn't leave? And when I went back to Egypt and I experienced very briefly for 2 years or 3 years, I experienced Egyptians around me who knew who they were, who understood what they are, where they come from. As much as it empowered their identity, it restricted maybe what they can be. So I think it's a double-edged idea. It's like, depends on your experience, it depends on your upbringing, it depends on your community. Being an Egyptian can be conforming, but also empowering. So it depends on how you see it. We were the cousins that came back from abroad. Oh my God, I missed fool. To them it's like, fool again. What's your problem? So it depends on how it depends on how you see it. But during my time in Egypt, the longer time that I spent, it gave me perspective, because there were moments where I did not want to be there. I missed being around different people. I hated that everybody around me sounded like me. That maybe because of my comfort zone or my muscle memory that was used to camouflaging in and out of communities, maybe. But I think it hugely depends. In my experience and in my family's experience, and my family bring this up a lot, sometimes they regret it. Sometimes they think, if they'd stayed, they wouldn't have felt this conflicted about who they are. Because I am, to a degree, or we are as a collective to a degree, still conflicted. When you don't belong anywhere, you have a hard time believing in yourself. It's weird. It's a bit of an irony. You have a hard time believing in who you are because you don't know who you are. Thus, you don't invest much because we're leaving anyways. So you don't invest much in friendships. You don't invest much in investment, tangibly. You don't invest much in, you don't own anything. You don't really own anything. So you being a visitor to everywhere is kind of, I don't know how to say, I really can't, I don't know what the word is, but it makes you hesitant to become anything. You don't want to become, you can't, because you're boundless at this point. But there's a freedom in that. So it depends, again, it's this yes and no gray answer. I don't know. I was personally empowered at points, but I was allowed to experience belonging also for 2 years, which I didn't really like as much. So I think there's like a gray area which I exist in. But again, maybe if this question were to be pointed to my parents, I think they would give you a very different answer. So yeah, I don't know. I think that was a bit of an unclear answer. So.
No, it was very clear. I don't know if other people who haven't grown up in the GCC will think so, but I felt like it was very clear. I completely get where you're coming from.